Hashtag the Watcher in Pinemont Forest. The first thing I noticed when I woke up wasn't the rain drumming against my tent, it was the silence underneath it. No insects chirping, no rustling leaves, no distant owl calls. Just rain and the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the suffocating quiet of Pinemont Forest. My phone showed 3:17 a.m. I'd been camping alone for 2 days, trying to clear my head after the divorce papers arrived. Sarah had kept the house, the dog, most of our friends. What they didn't say was that she'd been watching me for months before she left, studying my routines like I was some kind of specimen. I'd driven 3 hours north to lose myself in 50,000 acres of state forest, carrying a backpack full of freeze-dried meals and naive optimism that nature could heal what people break. The rain had started around midnight, turning the forest floor into a sponge beneath my tent. I'd pitched camp in a small clearing about 2 miles from any marked trail. The isolation felt perfect yesterday afternoon. Now it felt like a mistake. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. Everything looked normal. Backpack propped against the corner, water bottles lined up beside my hiking boots, camp stove where I'd left it after dinner. But something felt wrong, like walking into your own house and sensing someone had been there while you were gone. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound, barely audible over the rain. Metal against rock, rhythmic and deliberate. I held my breath and listened. There it was again. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. Like someone sharpening a knife on stone, about 20 feet from my tent. My heart started hammering. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen showed no signal. Of course. I was miles from the nearest cell tower. The Forest Service warning flashed through my mind. Limited emergency response capability in backcountry areas. Hikers assume all risk. The scraping stopped. I waited, counting heartbeats, straining to hear anything beyond the rain's monotonous patter. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe. I know you're awake in there. The voice came from directly outside my tent, soft and conversational. A woman's voice, gravelly from years of cigarettes or shouting. My blood turned to ice water. Been watching you since yesterday, she continued, and I could hear the smile in her words. Saw you hiking in with that fancy RI backpack and those clean boots. City boy playing survivor. I reached slowly for the canister of bear spray clipped to my backpack, my hands shaking so badly I nearly knocked over my water bottle. Now don't you go reaching for anything you might regret, the voice said, closer now. Right outside the tent flap. I've got something here that reaches a lot farther than whatever you're fumbling around for. I froze, bear spray half drawn. What do you want? Want? She laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. What makes you think I want anything from you, city boy? Maybe I'm just being neighborly. Checking on a fellow camper in this nasty weather. There's no campground here. This is backcountry. Oh, I know exactly where we are. The tent wall beside my head rustled as something brushed against it. Been living in these woods longer than you've been wearing those expensive hiking boots. This here's my neighborhood, and you're the tourist. My mind raced through options. The tent had 2 exits. The main flap she was watching and a smaller emergency exit at the back. But moving toward either meant making noise. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm just passing through. I'll pack up and leave first thing in the morning. Dawn. She repeated the word like she was tasting something sour. You think this ends at dawn? You think morning comes and I just disappear like some kind of vampire? Something metal tapped against the tent's aluminum frame. Tap, 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 methodical and sharp. I've been watching you for 2 days, remember? You're not going anywhere come morning. I heard footsteps, bare feet squelching in mud, circling the tent clockwise. The footsteps completed one full circle, then another, each step deliberate and measured like she was performing some kind of ritual. Tell me something, city boy. Her voice came from the tent's back corner now. You ever killed anything? The question hit me like a physical blow. What? Simple question. You ever taken a life? Animal, person, doesn't matter. Just wondering if you know what it feels like. No. The word came out as barely a whisper. Well, that's about to change. What I discovered next made me question everything I thought I knew about survival instincts, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. The footsteps stopped directly behind my tent's rear emergency exit. I could hear her breathing now, slow and controlled. The rain seemed to intensify, but underneath that natural rhythm I caught something else, a soft metallic clicking. My flashlight beam wandered across the tent's interior, and that's when I saw it. A small hole in the back wall, perfectly round, about the size of a pencil. Fresh cut, the edges still sharp and clean. She'd been working while I slept. Smart boy. Her voice drifted through the hole. Found my peephole. The beam of my flashlight caught something glinting through the opening, metal, reflecting the LED light back at me. I pressed my face closer to the wall, trying to see what she was holding, and froze. An eye stared back at me through the hole. Human, bloodshot, surrounded by deep wrinkles and framed by stringy gray hair. She'd been watching me sleep. Watching me wake up. Watching me fumble for my gear in blind panic. Wave hello? She whispered. I jerked backward, knocking over my camp stove with a metallic crash. The eye disappeared, replaced by darkness and soft laughter. Cat's out of the bag now, isn't it? Her voice moved around the tent again, faster this time. No more pretending this is just a friendly chat between neighbors. I had to move. Staying trapped in the tent was suicide. How long have you been living out here? Long enough to know every tree, every trail, every place a scared city boy might try to run. The circling stopped. Long enough to know that cell phone of yours won't work for another 8 miles in any direction. Long enough to know the Forest Service doesn't patrol this section until September. 3 months away. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the map I'd studied. The main trail was 2 miles southeast, but between here and there lay thick forest, rocky terrain, and at least one significant creek. I can hear you thinking, she said. Planning your big escape. Let me save you some time. I know these woods better than you know your own bedroom. Plus, I've got something you don't. What's that? Nothing left to lose. The words hung in the air like smoke. I'd heard that phrase before, usually from people who'd been pushed past their breaking point. People who'd been abandoned by the same society I represented with my REI gear and city soft hands. What happened to you? I asked, genuinely curious despite the terror. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then her voice came again, softer now, almost human. Same thing that happened to you, I expect. Someone I trusted decided I wasn't worth keeping around. The similarity struck me like a physical blow. Sarah's voice echoed in my memory. You've changed, Mark. You're not the person I married. But there's a difference between you and me. The woman continued, her voice hardening again. When my world fell apart, I didn't run to the woods to find myself. I came here to disappear completely. And I did a damn good job of it. Something scraped against the tent's front zipper, metal teeth sliding against metal teeth. She was opening the main entrance. Time's up, city boy. You've got about 10 seconds to decide how this goes. I gripped the bear spray tighter. The zipper continued its slow descent, revealing a slice of darkness beyond the tent's orange walls. 10. Her voice came from the darkness. My free hand found the tent's rear emergency exit. 9. I took a deep breath and made my choice. 8. The truth behind what happened in those next few moments will stay with me forever. I yanked both zippers simultaneously and rolled backward out of the tent into the muddy forest floor. Rain hit my face like ice pellets, and I came up running, crashing through undergrowth with my flashlight beams swinging wildly ahead of me. Behind me, I heard her laugh, not angry or surprised, but delighted. There we go, she called out. Now we're having fun. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, my hiking boots slipping on wet pine needles and hidden roots. The forest floor sloped downward, which meant I was heading toward the creek. Water meant direction, follow it downstream and eventually hit civilization. But as I ran, a horrible realization crept into my thoughts. I wasn't hearing pursuit. No crashing footsteps, no breaking branches. Either she was impossibly quiet, or she wasn't chasing me because she didn't need to. She knew where I was going. I stopped running and clicked off my flashlight, plunging myself into absolute darkness. I needed to think like her. She'd been living rough in these woods, surviving, avoiding detection. That took intelligence, patience, and deep understanding of both terrain and human behavior. She wasn't just some crazy homeless woman, she was an apex predator in her own environment. I dropped to my knees and crawled forward, feeling ahead with my hands for obstacles. Progress was painfully slow, but at least I was moving silently. The sound of running water grew clearer. But as I crawled through the undergrowth, my hand touched something that shouldn't have been there. Fabric. Synthetic material, soaked with rain but still recognizably human-made. A backpack. Another hiker's gear, abandoned in the forest. My blood turned to slush. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, keeping the beam low. The pack was olive green, military surplus, with a sleeping bag strapped to the bottom. But it was what lay beside the pack that made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. Bones. Human bones, picked clean and scattered by animals but still recognizably part of a skeleton. A skull grinned up at me from the pine needles, its empty sockets reflecting my flashlight beam like dark mirrors. "Found my last neighbor, did you?" Her voice came from directly above me. I looked up and saw her perched in the branches of a massive pine tree, maybe 15 feet off the ground, as comfortable as a bird on its roost. "He was a nice fellow," she continued conversationally. "Experienced hiker, had all the right gear, knew what he was doing. Lasted almost a week before I caught him." I scrambled backward, away from the bones. She dropped from the tree with cat-like grace, landing in a crouch just 10 feet away from me. In the flashlight's glare, I got my first clear look at her. She was older than her voice had suggested, maybe 60, with wild gray hair and clothes that might have once been camping gear but were now just rags held together with duct tape and determination. But her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and completely without mercy. And in her right hand she held a hunting knife with a blade that looked like it could gut a deer. "Your turn, city boy." The final piece of the puzzle changed everything, and there was no going back. She moved toward me with casual confidence, knife held low and ready. I raised the bear spray and pulled the trigger, sending an orange stream of capsaicin into the space between us. But she'd anticipated it. She ducked to the side and kept coming, the spray passing harmlessly through empty air. Before I could adjust my aim, she was inside my reach, one hand grabbing my wrist and the other bringing the knife toward my throat. I fell backward deliberately, pulling her off balance as we both hit the ground. We crashed into the scattered bones with sickening crunches, and I heard her grunt as her shoulder hit the base of the pine tree. The knife went flying into the darkness. For a moment, we both lay stunned in the pine needles and bone fragments. Then she was moving again, scrabbling toward where the knife had landed. I lunged after her, desperation giving me strength I didn't know I had. My hands found the knife handle just as hers closed around the blade. She jerked backward, and I felt the metal slide through her fingers, leaving dark stains on the steel. "You cut me," she said, sounding more surprised than angry. She held up her hand, deep gashes across her palm. "Been a long time since someone drew my blood." She smiled, and in that expression I saw something that made my soul recoil, genuine pleasure at the pain and violence. She wasn't just surviving in these woods. She was enjoying what she'd become. "My turn," she whispered. But I was already moving, knife in hand, driven by an instinct older than civilization. The blade found her chest just below the ribs, sliding between bones with surgical precision. Her eyes went wide with surprise, then something that might have been respect. "Well," she gasped, blood frothing at the corners of her mouth. "Looks like you do know what it feels like after all." She collapsed backward into the bone pile, her breathing growing shallow and wet. I knelt beside her in the rain, still gripping the knife, waiting for the threat to end. But even as her life drained away, she kept smiling. You think this ends with me? She whispered. You think killing me makes you safe? Her hand moved weakly towards something hidden in her rags, a small notebook, pages swollen with moisture and covered with cramped handwriting. I pulled it free and angled my flashlight to read the first page. Names. Dozens of names, with dates and locations. Other hikers, other campers, other people who'd ventured into these woods alone and never come back. And at the bottom of the list, written in fresh ink, Mark Sterling, Pinemont Forest, May 2025. She'd been planning my death since before I'd even arrived. I sat in the rain and darkness, surrounded by bones and blood, holding a knife I'd used to kill another human being. The notebook's pages fluttered in the wind, revealing more names, more dates, a catalog of disappearances that stretched back years. I pocketed the notebook and started walking toward the sound of running water, leaving her body where it lay among the remains of her other victims. The creek would lead me to the trail would lead me to my car, and my car would take me back to a world where people didn't hunt each other through dark forests. But as I walked, her final words echoed in my mind. You think this ends with me? I reached the creek just as dawn began to filter through the trees, gray light revealing a landscape that looked nothing like the peaceful forest I'd hiked into 3 days ago. Everything seemed threatening now. Every shadow could hide another predator. Every sound could signal danger. I'd come to these woods to escape my problems, to find some kind of peace after my divorce. Instead, I discovered that the real monsters weren't hiding in the darkness of failed relationships or empty houses. They were waiting in places where no one would hear you scream, wearing human faces and carrying hunting knives. I followed the creek downstream, my hiking boots splashing through shallow water, and tried not to think about how easy it had been to slide that knife between her ribs. Or how good it had felt when she finally stopped breathing. By the time I reached my car, I'd already decided what I would tell the police. Self-defense. A crazy woman living in the woods who'd attacked me. They'd find her body, find the evidence of her crimes, and call me a hero for stopping a serial killer. They'd never know that part of me had enjoyed it. That part of me was already planning my next camping trip. I should have noticed him on the first day. Should have paid attention to the old man in the aluminum boat who never seemed to catch any fish, just drifted along the shoreline watching our campsite with eyes that never blinked. But I was too busy arguing with Jessica about the tent setup, too focused on proving I could handle a weekend camping trip without checking my phone every 5 minutes. 3 months of couples therapy had led to this, Dr. Martinez's suggestion that we reconnect with nature and each other, away from digital distractions. So here we were at Clearwater Lake, surrounded by pine trees and the kind of oppressive silence that made me understand why our ancestors feared the dark. Our campsite sat on a small peninsula, giving us a panoramic view of the water. The closest other campers were half a mile away. Perfect for romantic reconnection, according to the reservation website. Perfect for something else entirely, as I was about to discover. There's that fisherman again, Jessica said on our second morning, pointing across the water. Same spot as yesterday. About 200 yards out, an elderly man sat motionless in a small fishing boat. He wore a faded red baseball cap and clothes that had seen better decades. The boat hadn't moved in the 20 minutes I'd been awake. Maybe it's a good fishing spot, I said, scraping blackened pancake batter off the pan. He's not fishing, though. Look at his line, it's just floating on the surface. And he keeps looking over here. I squinted across the water. The old man's attention seemed focused on our campsite rather than the water around his boat. As I watched, he raised something to his face, binoculars, maybe. Probably just curious about new campers, I said, but something cold settled in my stomach. Jessica frowned. That's not curiosity, David. That's surveillance. The word hung between us like smoke. Surveillance. But watching the old man's boat bob gently on the still water, his attention never wavering from our sight, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. We spent the day hiking the lake's perimeter trail. But every time we stopped to rest, I found myself scanning the lake for that aluminum boat. He was always there. Sometimes close to shore, sometimes in the middle of the lake, but always positioned where he could see our campsite. And he never seemed to actually fish. "There," Jessica said during our third stop, pointing down at the water. "Tell me that's normal behavior." From this elevated position, I could see the old man clearly for the first time. He was older than I'd initially thought, maybe 70, with weathered skin and the kind of stillness that comes from decades of patience. But it was his equipment that made my mouth go dry. Spread across the boat's bench seat were items that had nothing to do with fishing. A notebook, thick with pages and wrapped in plastic. What looked like a camera with a telephoto lens. And military-grade binoculars that he was currently using to study our campsite. "We should go," Jessica whispered. "Pack up and leave. This isn't right." Part of me agreed. But another part, the stubborn male pride that Dr. Martinez said was destroying our relationship, refused to be driven away by some harmless old fisherman. "Let's give it one more night," I said. "If he's still there tomorrow, we'll pack up after breakfast." That decision nearly cost us everything. What I discovered next made me question everything I thought I knew about the difference between harmless eccentricity and predatory stalking. The rain started just after sunset, building to a steady downpour by the time we zipped ourselves into our tent. The sound was oddly comforting, white noise that masked the creaking of trees and the lap of water against shore. But it also masked other sounds, as I discovered when I woke up at 2:30 a.m. I unzipped the tent quietly and stepped into the cool night air. The rain had stopped, leaving everything dripping and fresh smelling. The lake stretched out like an obsidian mirror. That's when I saw the light. A dim red glow, moving slowly along the shoreline about 100 yards to our left. The movement was too methodical, too purposeful. The light would stop for several minutes, sweep back and forth in a searching pattern, then continue along the shore. I grabbed my flashlight and crept through the trees toward the mysterious glow. As I got closer, I could make out a human figure bent over something on the ground. The old fisherman. But he wasn't fishing now, he was digging. I crouched behind a fallen log about 30 feet away and watched in growing horror. The red light came from a headlamp that cast an eerie glow over his activities. He was excavating something from a shallow depression near the water's edge, his movements careful and practiced. Every few minutes, he would stop digging and consult that plastic-wrapped notebook. Then he pulled something from the hole that made my blood freeze. A human skull, yellowed with age and missing its lower jaw. He examined it briefly, then placed it carefully in a canvas bag beside several other objects I couldn't identify. I must have made some sound because his head jerked up and those pale eyes swept the tree line where I was hiding. I held my breath and pressed myself against the log, praying the shadows would conceal me. For what felt like hours, he studied the forest. Then, apparently satisfied, he returned to his work. But I'd seen enough. I crept back to our campsite, my mind racing. What I'd witnessed wasn't just strange behavior, it was evidence of something far more sinister. The methodical way he'd worked, the notebook full of what I now suspected were locations and dates, the careful examination of human remains. How many others had camped at this lake? How many had noticed the old fisherman watching from his boat? And how many had simply disappeared into the vast wilderness? I was debating whether to wake Jessica when I heard the sound of an aluminum boat scraping against our small beach. He'd come for us. I peered through the tent's mesh window and saw him pulling his boat onto the sandy shore. In the moonlight I could see he carried a long-handled tool, a shovel, or maybe something worse. "Jessica," I whispered, shaking her gently. "We have to go. Now." She came awake instantly. "What's wrong?" "The fisherman. He's here." Before she could respond, we heard footsteps circling our tent, slow, deliberate. Then his voice, rusty from disuse, drifted through the nylon walls. "I know you saw me tonight, son. Know you were watching from the trees." My heart hammered against my ribs. Jessica grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Been fishing this lake for 43 years. He continued, his voice conversational and terrifying. "Seen all kinds of folks come and go. City people, mostly. Always so curious about things that ain't their business. The footsteps stopped directly outside our tent's entrance. I could see his shadow through the fabric. Thing is, some fish bite better when you use the right bait. And I've learned that city folks make excellent bait for the really big ones. The kind that live deep in the lake where nobody ever goes looking. I heard the metallic sound of a zipper starting to open, not our tent, but something else. The canvas bag I'd seen him filling with bones. Course, first I need to dress the bait proper. Clean it, prepare it. That takes time and privacy. The final piece of the puzzle changed everything, and there was no going back. Jessica was already moving, gathering our phones and car keys. The tent had a back exit we never used. While the old man continued his monologue outside the main entrance, we crept toward our only escape route. Now don't make this harder than it needs to be, he said, and I heard our tent's main zipper starting to open. Been tracking you two since you arrived. Know exactly how many steps it is back to your car, know every trail and hiding spot. Running just makes the whole thing more interesting for me. I eased the back zipper down inch by inch. Jessica slipped through first, then me, and we found ourselves crouched in the cold night air. Well now, came his voice from inside our tent. Looks like they want to play after all. We ran. Through the trees, stumbling over roots and low branches, guided only by faint moonlight. Behind us, I could hear him moving with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of this terrain. No crashing through underbrush, no cursing. Just a steady, relentless sound of pursuit. Our car was parked in a clearing about a quarter-mile from the campsite. In the darkness, with adrenaline and terror making every shadow look like a threat, it might as well have been on another planet. There, Jessica gasped, pointing ahead. I could see the metallic glint of our Honda's roof through the trees. That's when the flashlight beam hit us. Told you I knew these woods? His voice came from directly ahead, cutting off our path to the car. Somehow, he'd gotten there first. 43 years of walking these trails. Know every shortcut, every game path, every place a scared rabbit might try to hide. The beam swept back and forth, searching. We dove behind a cluster of boulders. Here's what's going to happen, he continued. You're going to come out nice and peaceful like. Going to walk back to my boat like civilized folks. Try to run again, and I'll have to hurt you before I kill you. Jessica's hand found mine in the darkness, her fingers ice cold and trembling. Course, if you make me come find you, he said, his voice closer now. I might just take my time with the whole process. Maybe keep you both alive for a while, see how long city folk last when they're properly motivated. The flashlight beam swept closer to our hiding spot. In seconds he would find us. That's when Jessica picked up a rock the size of a softball and hurled it as hard as she could into the forest behind us. It crashed through branches and hit a tree with a satisfying thunk about 50 yards away. There we go, the old man said, and his footsteps moved away from us toward the sound. Playing games now, are we? We didn't wait to see if the distraction would work. We ran for the car in a desperate sprint, keys already in my hand, and dove into the front seats just as his flashlight beam swung back toward the clearing. The engine turned over on the first try. We reversed out of the clearing in a spray of gravel and pine needles, our headlights catching a glimpse of him standing at the tree line with what I now saw was definitely not a fishing rod. We didn't stop driving until we reached the sheriff's station in the nearest town, 45 minutes of white-knuckle terror down winding mountain roads. The deputy who took our statement was polite but skeptical until we mentioned the bones and the notebook. Then his expression changed, and he started making phone calls. They found his camp the next morning, a carefully hidden site on the far side of the lake. The notebook contained entries going back 7 years, detailed observations of campers and hikers, with notes about their routines, their equipment, and their disappearance dates. 43 names in total, all listed as missing persons in surrounding counties. They never found the bodies. The lake was too deep, the forest too vast. But they found enough evidence to piece together what had been happening to people who came to enjoy the peace and beauty of Clearwater Lake. The old man himself was never caught. When authorities arrived at his camp, they found everything except him. His boat was still tied to a makeshift dock, his belongings still arranged in their neat, obsessive order. But he had vanished into the wilderness like smoke. The lake was closed to camping indefinitely. Jessica and I broke up 2 weeks after we got back to the city. Turns out shared trauma isn't actually a foundation for lasting love. But sometimes, when it rains at night, I find myself thinking about Clearwater Lake. About all the people who noticed a harmless old fisherman watching from his boat and decided it wasn't worth worrying about. About how easy it is to dismiss the feeling that you're being watched until it's too late to run. The authorities assured us he was probably dead. A man his age couldn't survive long in the wilderness without supplies. But they never found a body, and that notebook had 43 names in it. 43 people who thought they were safe. I still check my locks twice every night. Still scan crowds for weathered faces and pale eyes that watch too intently. Because I learned something at Clearwater Lake that I'll never forget. The most dangerous predators are the ones who know how to wait. And some of them have been practicing patience for 43 years. The scraping started on the third night, soft and rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across bark. But there were no trees close enough to our tent for branches to cause it, and the sound was too deliberate, too measured to be anything natural. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the steady rain drumming against the tent fly, trying to convince myself it was just forest sounds. Mice, maybe? Or a porcupine looking for salt on our gear. But the scraping came in patterns. 3 short scratches, pause, 3 long ones, pause, 3 short again. Like someone tapping out a message in Morse code. My wife Sarah shifted beside me, and I realized she was awake too, her breathing shallow and controlled in the way it got when she was trying not to panic. We'd been married 8 years, and I knew all her tells by now. The way she went perfectly still when she was scared, the way she held her breath when she was listening for something she didn't want to hear. "David," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it over the rain. "Do you hear that?" I wanted to say no. Wanted to tell her it was nothing, that she should go back to sleep, that everything was fine. But the scraping continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of our tent like something circling, testing for weaknesses. We'd come to Blackwood National Forest to save our marriage. 6 months of couples counseling had led to Dr. Chen's recommendation. Get away from your routines. Remove the distractions. Spend time together without screens or work, or the daily grind that's pulling you apart. So here we were, 3 days into a week-long camping trip, sleeping in a tent for the first time since our honeymoon. The first 2 days had been perfect. We'd hiked the woodland trails, cooked simple meals over our camp stove, played cards by lantern light, and talked more than we had in years. For the first time since Sarah's miscarriage 18 months ago, it felt like we might actually find our way back to each other. Then the scraping started. It moved counterclockwise around our tent, always staying just outside the reach of our headlamps when we clicked them on to investigate. The sound would stop the moment we made any noise, waiting with infinite patience until we settled back into our sleeping bags before resuming its methodical circuit. "What do you think it is?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with the kind of control that meant she was one wrong answer away from complete panic. I didn't know. In 3 days of hiking, we hadn't seen any large wildlife. No bear sign, no fresh deer tracks, certainly nothing that would be bold enough to investigate a human campsite after dark. The ranger at the visitor center had assured us that Blackwood was one of the safest parks in the system, family-friendly, well-maintained, with regular patrol sweeps to monitor campers. But something was out there in the darkness beyond our thin nylon walls, something patient enough to spend hours circling our tent, something with claws or tools sharp enough to scrape against stone and wood. "Probably just a raccoon," I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. "They're curious about food smells." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The scraping was too purposeful, too systematic. And it was getting closer to the tent with each circuit, the sound growing sharper and more distinct. Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness, her fingers ice-cold despite the warmth of her sleeping bag. "I want to leave," she whispered. "First thing in the morning? Pack up and go home." Part of me wanted to agree. The rational part that had learned to trust Sarah's instincts. The part that remembered she'd been right about her boss's harassment 6 months before HR finally took action. Right about the faulty wiring in our kitchen that the electrician had initially dismissed as perfectly safe. But another part, the stubborn pride that Dr. Chen said was one of our biggest problems, refused to be driven away by some unknown animal. We'd planned this trip for months, spent money we couldn't really afford on gear and permits. More importantly, this was supposed to be our chance to reconnect, to prove we could still function as a team when everything else had fallen apart. "Let's see how it goes tomorrow," I said. "If it comes back tomorrow night, we'll pack up and head home early." The scraping stopped. Complete silence except for the rain and our own breathing. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened, and I could feel her pulse racing through her fingertips. Then it started again, but different this time. Instead of circling, it seemed to be working on something specific. The sound was more focused, more intense, like whatever was out there had found what it was looking for and was now trying to get through it. Or trying to get in. What I discovered next made me question everything I thought I knew about the things that live in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. The scraping continued for another hour, growing more aggressive as the night wore on. By 3 a.m., it sounded like something was actively trying to dig through the forest floor just outside our tent. The methodical scratching had become frantic scrabbling, punctuated by occasional thuds that shook the ground beneath us. "That's not an animal," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Animals don't work like that. They don't plan." She was right. Whatever was out there displayed a level of persistence and problem-solving that felt distinctly unnatural. When the scraping encountered resistance, rocks, roots, hard-packed earth, it would pause, probe around the obstacle, then resume from a different angle. I grabbed my headlamp and unzipped the tent's mesh window, shining the beam into the darkness beyond. The scraping stopped immediately, but I could see the evidence of whatever had been working out there. Fresh dirt scattered across the pine needles. Deep gouges in the earth arranged in neat, parallel lines. And something else that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Human footprints, bare and elongated, with what looked like claw marks extending from each toe. "Jesus Christ!" I breathed, playing the light across the disturbed ground. The prints circled our tent in a perfect spiral, starting about 20 feet out and working inward with each revolution. At the center of the spiral, directly beside our tent's entrance, someone or something had been digging a hole. "What is it?" Sarah asked, but I couldn't find words to describe what I was seeing. The hole was roughly 3 feet deep and perfectly round, like someone had been using a post-hole digger. But the sides were scratched and clawed rather than cut clean, and at the bottom, barely visible in the headlamp's beam, something white gleamed against the dark earth. Bone. Definitely bone, though I couldn't tell if it was animal or human from this distance. I clicked off the headlamp and zipped the window shut, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the zipper. Sarah was sitting up in her sleeping bag, eyes wide in the darkness. "We're leaving," I said. "Right now. Pack everything you can carry and leave the rest." "What did you see?" "Something that shouldn't exist." We worked in tense silence, stuffing our sleeping bags and essential gear into our backpacks by the dim glow of a penlight. The scraping had stopped completely, but somehow that felt worse than when it was circling us. At least then we knew where it was. Sarah was rolling up her sleeping pad when the sound changed again. Not scraping now, but tapping. Sharp, deliberate raps against something hard. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from directly beneath us. "It's under the tent," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with terror. "It's digging up from underneath." The tapping grew more insistent, more urgent, like whatever was down there had realized we were awake and moving around. I could feel vibrations through the tent floor, could see small puffs of dirt rising through the fabric mesh. "Go," I said, grabbing our packs and pushing Sarah toward the tent's entrance. Now. We stumbled out into the rain-soaked night, our headlamps casting wild shadows between the trees as we ran. Behind us, the tapping became pounding, then tearing sounds as something ripped through the tent floor from below. I risked one look back and saw our tent collapsing in on itself, the center sinking as if something was pulling it down into the earth. Then a hand emerged from the hole, pale, elongated, with fingers that were far too long and nails that curved like talons. We ran harder. The trail back to the parking area was 3 miles of winding forest path, marked with reflective blazes that were nearly impossible to see in the rain and darkness. We stumbled through the undergrowth, crashing into trees and low branches, driven by pure terror and the sound of something large moving through the forest behind us. It didn't chase us the way an animal would, with speed and aggression. Instead, it followed with the same methodical patience it had shown while circling our tent. We could hear it moving parallel to the trail, never quite visible in our headlamp beams but always there, keeping pace with our panicked flight. "The car!" Sarah gasped, pointing ahead. I could see the faint outline of our Honda through the trees, parked in the small gravel lot where the trail began. We sprinted the last 100 yards, fumbling with keys and door handles while whatever had been following us emerged from the tree line. In the brief illumination of our headlights, I caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist: pale skin stretched over an elongated frame, limbs that bent in ways human joints weren't designed for, and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The engine turned over on the second try, and we reversed out of the parking lot in a shower of gravel and pine needles. In the rearview mirror, I could see it standing at the edge of the forest, perfectly still, watching us leave with those impossible reflective eyes. We drove in silence for 20 minutes before either of us found the courage to speak. "What was that?" Sarah finally asked. I didn't have an answer. Couldn't have one, because acknowledging what we'd seen would mean accepting that the world contained things that existed outside the boundaries of rational explanation. "I don't know," I said. "But we're not going back." We found a motel 30 miles away and spent the rest of the night huddled together in a room with 3 deadbolts and a chain lock, jumping at every sound from the hallway. In the morning, we called the park service to report our abandoned campsite, claiming a family emergency had forced us to leave early. The ranger who took our call was polite but unconcerned. "Happens more often than you'd think," he said. "Folks get spooked by night sounds and bail out early. We'll send someone to clean up your site." But when we called back 3 days later to ask about our gear, the ranger told us they'd found our campsite exactly as we'd left it. Tent still standing, sleeping bags still laid out, no sign of disturbance except for some scattered pine needles and what looked like old animal burrows around the perimeter. "No holes?" I asked. "Nothing like that," he said. "Just the usual forest floor stuff. You sure you're thinking of the right campsite?" I hung up without answering. Sarah and I never talked about what happened at Blackwood. Not to each other, not to Dr. Chin, not to anyone. Some experiences exist outside the realm of language, beyond the ability of words to capture or explain. But our marriage survived. More than survived, it thrived. Shared trauma, it turns out, can be just as powerful as shared joy when it comes to bonding 2 people together. We moved to a house in the suburbs, far from any wilderness areas, and started talking about trying for another baby. Sometimes, though, when it rains at night, I find myself listening for sounds that shouldn't exist. Scraping against the foundation of our house. Tapping beneath the floorboards. The methodical patience of something that has all the time in the world to dig its way closer to the surface. And sometimes, just before dawn, I hear it. The truth behind what happened in those next few moments will stay with me forever. Last month, Sarah found an article in the local newspaper about a missing family. The Hendersons, parents and 2 young children, had vanished from their campsite in Blackwood National Forest. Their tent was found intact, personal belongings undisturbed, no sign of struggle or foul play. But according to the article, park rangers had discovered something unusual at the campsite. A series of perfectly round holes, each about 3 feet deep, arranged in a spiral pattern around where the family's tent had been pitched. "They're calling it an animal investigation site," Sarah said, reading over my shoulder. "Probably black bears looking for food." I nodded and turned the page, not trusting myself to speak. Because I knew better. knew that somewhere in the vast wilderness of Blackwood National Forest, something patient and methodical was still digging, still circling, still waiting for the next family to set up camp in the wrong place at the wrong time. The scraping had found new victims. And someday, if we weren't careful, it might find us again. Trust me, Marcus said, his weathered face creasing into what was supposed to be a reassuring smile. I know these mountains better than anyone. What I'm suggesting is what's best for the group. But standing there in the rain at 2 a.m., watching our guide methodically sort through our confiscated phones and car keys by the light of his headlamp, I realized that Marcus Chan's definition of what's best might be very different from ours. The 6 of us had booked this week-long wilderness survival course through Mountain Spirit Adventures. Corporate team building, my boss had called it. A chance for our marketing department to bond away from screens and deadlines. Marcus had met us at the trailhead 3 days ago with the kind of confidence that comes from 20 years of guiding city people through the wilderness. Mid-50s, compact and wiry, with sun-damaged skin and casual competence that made you feel instantly safer. He'd led us into the Cascade Mountains with the promise that we'd emerge as a real team, not just co-workers. The first 2 days had been everything we'd hoped for. Marcus taught us to read weather patterns, identify edible plants, build shelters that kept us dry. When Lisa sprained her ankle, he'd fashioned a walking stick and adjusted our route without complaint. When Kevin started showing signs of altitude sickness, Marcus monitored him through the night. He seemed genuinely concerned about our welfare, always reminding us to stay hydrated, to watch our footing, to never wander off alone. The mountains don't forgive mistakes, he'd say. That's why you have me. To keep you safe. But by the 3rd day, his protectiveness had started to feel less like guidance and more like control. It began with small things. He'd taken our phones on the first day, claiming they were unnecessary distractions. Fair enough, we'd signed up for digital detox. But when Rachel asked for her phone back to take pictures of a sunrise, Marcus had refused. Photography creates distance between you and the moment, he'd explained. Then he'd collected our car keys, saying he'd hold them for safekeeping, to prevent anyone from being tempted to leave early. Again, this seemed reasonable. We'd paid for a week-long experience. But now, watching him sort through our belongings in the middle of the night like he was conducting an inventory, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a terrible mistake trusting him. Marcus? I called softly. What are you doing? He looked up, his headlamp beam hitting me square in the eyes. Just making sure everything's secure, David. Weather's turning bad. We might need to move camp quickly tomorrow. At 2 in the morning? Best time to organize gear. Quiet, no distractions. He held up Rachel's iPhone, its pink case glinting in the light. Amazing how dependent people become on these things. Even out here, you'd rather stare at a screen than appreciate what's around you. There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. Not anger, exactly, but disappointed condescension. We're not using them, I said. You made sure of that. That's right. I did. He slipped the phone into a waterproof bag with the others. Because that's what's best for the group. That's what you're paying me for, to make the decisions that keep everyone safe and on track. Marcus had chosen this campsite himself, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, miles from any marked trail. Private, he'd called it. Away from weekend warriors and casual hikers. Now it just felt isolated. Maybe we should head back tomorrow, I suggested. The weather forecast looked pretty bad for the rest of the week. Marcus's headlamp beam stayed fixed on my face, and I could see his expression harden. Leaving early isn't an option, David. Your company paid for a full week-long program, and that's what you're going to get. Besides, a little adversity builds character. I'm not running away. I'm just questioning my judgment. He stood up slowly, and I realized how much bigger he was than I'd initially thought. Not tall, but solid in the way of someone who'd spent decades hauling packs and chopping wood. That's natural. City people always want to second-guess the expert when they start feeling uncomfortable. The way he said "city people" made it sound like an insult. "Look, Marcus, I appreciate everything you've taught us, but—" "No buts." His voice cut through the rain like a blade. "You signed contracts, made commitments. And right now, what's best for the group is following my lead without question." He started walking toward me, still holding the bag of phones and keys. "I've been doing this for 20 years, David. I've seen what happens when groups start fragmenting, when individuals start putting their own comfort ahead of the team's needs. It never ends well." Something in his tone made me think he wasn't just talking about wilderness survival anymore. What I discovered next made me question everything I thought I knew about the difference between protection and imprisonment. The next morning brought steady rain and the revelation that our situation was far worse than I'd imagined. When Kevin complained about stomach cramps and asked to cut the trip short, Marcus became genuinely angry for the first time. "Absolutely not," he'd snapped, his usual patient demeanor cracking. "You committed to 7 days. I'm not going to let one person's weakness undermine the entire group dynamic." "I'm not being weak," Kevin protested. "I'm sick. It's mental resistance to discomfort. Classic city dweller syndrome." Marcus was packing his gear with sharp, aggressive movements. "You want to run back to your safe spaces the moment things get challenging." Lisa tried to mediate. "Maybe we could take a rest day. Let Kevin recover and—" "No." Marcus's voice brooked no argument. "Rest days create dependency. We're moving deeper into the mountains today, where you'll have no choice but to rely on each other and trust my guidance." "Deeper?" Rachel looked around at the dense forest surrounding us. "But shouldn't we be heading back toward the trailhead by now?" "It's day 4. Marcus shouldered his pack and started walking toward what looked like a game trail barely visible through the undergrowth. "The real learning happens when you can't just quit and go home. When you're committed fully to the experience." We followed because we didn't have a choice. He had our keys, our phones, our emergency supplies. More importantly, he had the knowledge of how to get out of these mountains. But as we hiked deeper into unmarked territory, bushwhacking through thick forest with no visible trail, I started to suspect that Marcus knew exactly where he was going, and it wasn't anywhere we wanted to be. "This doesn't look right," I said during a brief rest stop. "According to the brochure, we should be doing day hikes from a base camp, not pushing deeper into the backcountry." "The brochure is marketing material," Marcus replied, consulting a topographic map I'd never seen before. "Real transformation requires real commitment. Real isolation. How long are we planning to stay out here?" He looked up from the map with that same disappointed expression. "As long as it takes for the group to gel properly. Sometimes that's a week. Sometimes longer." "Longer?" Rachel's voice cracked with the first hint of real fear. "Our families are expecting us back on Sunday. We have jobs, responsibilities. You have an opportunity to become something more than just another group of cubicle drones who gave up when things got uncomfortable." Marcus folded the map with sharp, precise movements. "But only if you commit fully to the process." Kevin doubled over with another wave of stomach cramps, and when Marcus made no move to help him, the rest of us rushed over. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The map Marcus had been consulting wasn't a standard topographic map. It was hand-drawn, covered with notes in his cramped handwriting. Notes about optimal isolation distances, and psychological pressure points, and commitment reinforcement techniques. This wasn't a wilderness survival course. It was something else entirely. "Marcus," I said carefully, "I think we need to talk about ending this trip early. Kevin's genuinely sick and—" "Kevin's fine. You're all fine. You're just experiencing normal resistance to growth." He started walking again, his pace faster now, more urgent. "The mountains will teach you to push through that resistance. To understand that sometimes other people know what's best for you better than you do." We stumbled after him through the rain and dense undergrowth, no longer following any recognizable trail. The forest pressed in around us like a living thing. That night, Marcus selected a campsite in a narrow ravine, surrounded by steep walls of rock and thick forest. "Perfect shelter," he announced. "Private. Secure." But looking around at the steep walls and limited exits, it felt less like shelter and more like a trap. That's when I realized Marcus's definition of what's best for the group might include keeping us here indefinitely. The truth behind what happened in those next few moments will stay with me forever. It was Rachel who found Marcus's real notebook that night, hidden in the bottom of his pack while he was setting up his tent. Not the official course materials, but a leather-bound journal filled with entries about previous groups. "Listen to this," she whispered, reading by the light of her small LED flashlight while we huddled in Kevin's tent. "July 2023, Jenkins Group showed excellent progress after Week 3. Final breakthrough achieved Week 4 when they stopped asking about return dates." My stomach dropped. "Week 4? She flipped through more pages, her hands shaking. "September 2023, Morrison corporate team required 6 weeks to achieve full group cohesion. Early escape attempt by 2 members successfully discouraged through resource restriction." "Escape attempt?" Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. "There's more. December 2023, Williams family group, they never went home. He has notes about establishing permanent camp, about teaching them that their old lives were illusions." Kevin, despite his illness, was the first to put it together. "He's not a survival instructor. He's collecting people." We sat in horrified silence, listening to the rain drum against the tent walls and Marcus moving around the campsite outside. "We have to get out of here," Rachel whispered. "Tonight, while he's sleeping." "How?" I asked. "He has our keys, our phones, our emergency supplies. We don't even know which direction leads back to civilization." "We follow the water," Lisa said. "Streams always lead downhill, toward bigger water sources. Eventually toward roads." It was a plan born of desperation, but it was the only plan we had. We waited until Marcus's movements stopped, then slipped out of our tents one by one, leaving our heavy packs behind. The stream that ran through our campsite was swollen with rain, dark and fast-moving in the faint moonlight. We followed it downstream, stumbling over slippery rocks and fallen logs, driven by the certainty that staying meant disappearing forever into Marcus's twisted vision of group commitment. Behind us, I heard a shout, Marcus discovering our empty tents. Then the beam of his powerful headlamp sweeping through the forest, searching. "He's coming!" Kevin gasped. We ran as best we could in the darkness, following the stream's course as it wound through thick forest and steep ravines. Marcus's light stayed behind us, methodical and persistent, occasionally calling out in that same reasonable tone. "Come back! You're making a mistake. The mountains are dangerous at night." But we kept running, because we'd learned that Marcus's protection was more dangerous than anything the wilderness could offer. The stream led us downhill for hours, until my legs were shaking with exhaustion and Kevin was barely staying upright. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, we saw lights through the trees. Real lights, electric ones. A ranger station, small but official, with a government vehicle parked outside and warm yellow lights spilling from the windows. The ranger who answered our frantic knocking was a woman in her 30s, alert despite the early hour. "What are you folks doing out here in this weather?" "We need help," Rachel said, her words tumbling over each other. "Our guide, Marcus Chin, he's been holding us against our will. Taking groups into the wilderness and not bringing them back." The ranger's expression changed immediately. "Marcus Chin? We've been looking for him for months. He's not affiliated with any legitimate guiding service. Mountain Spirit Adventures was shut down last year after several groups went missing." As we gave our statements, the full scope of Marcus's operation became clear. He'd been operating independently for years, intercepting corporate groups and families looking for wilderness experiences, then gradually isolating them until they became completely dependent on his guidance. Some groups had been missing for months. "The psychology is simple," the ranger explained. "Take people out of their comfort zones, cut off their connections to the outside world, then position yourself as their only source of safety and direction. Eventually, they stop questioning your authority. But why? Lisa asked. What did he want from us? Control. Purpose. Some people become addicted to being needed, to being the center of other people's survival. He probably genuinely believed he was helping you become better people. Marcus was never found. Search teams scoured the area for weeks, but the mountains were vast and full of places where someone with his skills could disappear. But families and corporate groups still go missing in the Cascades. Still trust friendly guides who promise authentic wilderness experiences and team building through shared adversity. The mountains don't forgive mistakes, Marcus had told us. But the biggest mistake isn't trusting the wilderness. It's trusting someone who claims to know what's best for you better than you do. Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time.